So this is a story Rabbi Twersky relates. You probably heard it's a famous story, but it's a story with Nachum Chernobyl. So following his death, his wife, Nachum Chernobyl, his wife, would periodically, they're direct descendants from Nachum Chernobyl, the Twerskys. So following his death, so she would periodically visit his colleagues, his fellow disciples of the Baal Shem Tov and the Maggid, and they would support him. It was like the Chassidim weren't giving any money anymore after the Nachman passed on. But one time the Rebbetzin came to visit the Baruch of Mezhebush. He was a grandson of the Baal Shem Tov. Fine. And the Baruch says to her, tell me some stories about your husband, Nachman. So she sits there and then she gets up to leave. So he's astonished at her abrupt departure. She said as follows: through the many years I shared with my husband, I gathered innumerable incidents of his greatness. But at this very moment, not only can I not recall any story, I can't even retrieve his image. And I'm taking this as an indication to leave. So the Baruch escorts the Rebbetzin into the carriage. And just as the horses are about to move, she says to the driver, stop. Gets off the carriage and said, I recall one story which I had never revealed before and will do so now. And since I can't recall anything else, and this came to my mind now, so I'm taking it as a simim l'mayla that this is the story I have to tell you. And this is what she tells him. But Nachum and I lived in abject poverty. His entire day was spent, so it looks like Chassidim didn't give him much money either. His entire day was spent in the study of Torah and in prayerful devotion. Now, my husband, Reb Nachum, had a pair of film, which were very dear to him. Another story. So these parshas were written by Ephraim, the scribe, who the Baal Shem Tov considered to be second only to the Ezra and Nehemiah, who were called the scribes, Ezra Sefer. Can you imagine? So these tefillin were very special and most valuable. A wealthy member of the community had offered Reb Nachum 50 rubles for the tefillin, a sum which we could have lived without worries for an entire year. My husband said he would never part with the tefillin. There were times I pleaded with him to reconsider. The children didn't have any food for days. When they were cold due to a lack of proper clothing, we had no wood for the fire. And I would say, how can you be so heartless to your own children? They need food and clothing. For 2 rubles, you can buy a fine set of tefillin. And then we can afford the essentials of life with the remainder. But I learned eventually that my entreaties were in vain, that tefillin were not negotiable. Now, we were also raising an orphaned niece, Malkila, who shared our meager existence. I would say to my husband, when Malkila reaches marriageable age and needs a dowry, will you sell a tefillin then, won't you? After all, you are permitted to sell even a Torah to provide funds for a child to marry. And he would say he would deal with that when the time came. One year Rosh Hashanah approached. It was evident there's going to be a dearth of esrogim for Sukkot. This was not uncommon. For whatever reason, those esrogim arrived, and my husband was terribly upset over this. This is a mitzvah once a year, and not to bench esrog was inconceivable. He became depressed. On the way home from shul, the morning of the day out of Sukkot, my husband saw someone carrying an esrog in the lulav. Yeah, and he runs after him, and he says, how much would you take for the esrog in the lulav? And he said, Rabbi, you can't afford this. This is the only esrog in the entire region, and it's only for the wealthiest members of the community, for the wealthiest member who's paying 50 rubles for it. And Nachum remembered that he'd been offered 50 rubles for his tefillin. So he thought to himself, tefillin, my mitzvah I did today already. I won't need them for 9 days after Sukkot. But esrog I have to do tomorrow. He said, please wait. He runs off to the gvir, sells the tefillin, and comes back with a 50 ruble. So she tells the story. So she was out of the house, trying to gather some scraps for food for Yontif. And I see my husband is beaming with euphoria. So what's the big simcha? Maybe he got a few copies so we can buy some food for Yontif. He's ignoring my question and he's behaving like he just found a fortune. I pressed him for the reason for his joy, and he says to me, an esrog, an esrog. What? It's impossible. If it was such an esrog existed, it would cost a fortune. So he said, well, I sold its film to buy the esrog. When he said these words, all the years of deprivation would suddenly pass before my eyes. I saw the cold winters and no firewood, and the children shivering, the times we were hungry, nothing to eat. He wouldn't sell his film. Now he sells it for a piece of fruit that after Sukkot is worthless. And Malkila's dowry, my dear dead sister's child, that we have to raise, who would take it without a dowry? And he sold it for this. I couldn't bear it. Where's the esrog? He points to the cupboard. I took the esrog and I threw it into the ground and it broke into pieces. Finished. Gaman. My husband stood silent and motionless. He turned pale. And 2 streams of tears trickled down his cheeks into his beard. And after a moment, he said, my precious tefillin I have no longer. The opportunity to fulfill the mitzvah of esrog I also don't have. Now the Satan wants I should lose my temper and shout at my wife and ruin the spirit of simcha. This I'm not going to grant him. That was the end of the story. So the Baruch hears the story now, enraptured, and after a moment he said, Rebbetzin, that Nochem loved his children no less than you did. Their suffering certainly affected him as deeply as it did you, and his concern for Malkila's welfare also equaled yours. Yet I can grasp why he did not sell its film throughout all these years of deprivation. I can also grasp why he did sell it to acquire the esrog. But how it was possible that after all of this, he shows absolutely no trace of anger. See, this is only what Malchim could do. A wonderful day, folks.